Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Robert Gunther. I'm so excited that we have music to start our webinars now. And look how far we've come, all of us, in the last, year and a half or so. So I want to welcome you to the first of several Washington Conference webinars that we're going to be hosting over the summer. My name is Robert Gunther. I'm the Senior Vice President of Public Policy. And what we plan to do today is kind of give you a foundation of what to expect and when you come here in September for the Washington Conference. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the issues, what's in play, what's actually happening on some of the key issues. And then we'll talk about some of the Washington Conference planning for September as well. So what I'm going to do here is share my screen and we will get started in just a second. I can get the presentation mode. All right, everybody see that? Everybody good? Okay. Well, thank you again. I'm excited to be part of this group. Some of these faces, all these faces should be very familiar to many of you. I'm joined today by John Hawley, our Senior Director of Government Relations, Randy Russell, who has been part of the Russell, or is the Russell group, or part of the Russell group, the leader of the Russell group. That's a better way to put it, Randy. And the Legislative Counsel for United Fresh for many, many years. And then Molly Van Loo has joined us as our Senior Director of Nutrition Policy at United. So very excited to have you guys with us today and with this group. So just a quick kind of, talk about the Washington Conference. We're excited, obviously, to hold the conference, but more importantly, that we're going to be back in person here in Washington, D.C. It's going to be great, a lot of interaction. I know for a lot of us, this will be the first time, at least from a United Fresh perspective, to have an in-person meeting. So we're excited about that. It's also going to be, it's a big one. As you know, we're working on a joint collaboration merger. I'm not allowed to say that too much in terms of our PMA joining together starting next year. So we want to make sure this is a great ending to many years of Washington conferences that United Fresh has held. And also a lot of questions we've gotten, or we get all the time, about DC and what's happening here in DC. And we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later, but we are slowly opening here in DC. Some of the congressional offices will be open for visits. Some, again, as I mentioned, we may have to, others may come to face-to-face meetings, but we will, as I will talk about later, promise to maximize the personal connections with our members of Congress and our elected leaders during the September conference. So with that, I'm happy to introduce and welcome John Hawley to talk about bridges and trucks. I know there's more besides trucks, but I just, that was the best title I could come up with for this. So John, welcome, and look forward to your presentation.
Great. Just want to make sure my camera is showing. Amanda, the only camera I can see is Robert, so.
You are all good. You just keep going.
Okay, perfect. Well, welcome everybody. It's good to be with you. As Robert said, I work with the GR team. I know most of you, but glad to see some new faces here joining us to learn a little bit about Washington Conference. So as Senior Director of Government Relations and Public Policy, a lot of my work focuses on labor, which for many years has been the #1 issue that has been challenging the fresh produce industry. So just want to make sure I can bring everybody up to speed on where we are. As you may know, United Fresh has been a leader in this space on pushing legislation. We've had our most successful efforts in the House over the last 2 Congresses in pushing legislation that's known as the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, bipartisan legislation that was passed in the last Congress, and then when we had to start over in the new Congress was immediately passed again. It's the result of really a joint effort between agriculture employers, including United Fresh, and the agriculture worker labor movement to come to some kind of solution for our agriculture immigration challenges. So basically, we pushed 3 basic concepts. Number one is dealing with the current workforce and providing them some access to legalization to make sure that they can continue working in agriculture with earned status. Obviously, many of us in the produce world and throughout agriculture rely on foreign labor through the H-2A program. While the program is helpful and fills some of our needs, there are clear reforms that need to be made to that program. And so the legislation includes those as well. And then there is an enforcement mechanism. Many of you are familiar with the E-Verify program, and that legislation would make it mandatory for those participating agricultural employers. So we passed that legislation in the House earlier this year with bipartisan support, as I said. And we're taking the same approach in the Senate. We've identified a couple champions, and you may have read about that, either through our newsletters or through some of the other trade press that's been out there. But we participated, our CEO, Tom Stenzel, and a number of other agriculture CEOs participated in a meeting with the two Senate champions, Senator Mike Crapo, who's a Republican from Idaho, and Senator Michael Bennett, who's a Democrat from Colorado, as well as Secretary Tom Vilsack from USDA. So we're building that support. We want to make sure that the Senate bill addresses some of the concerns that we had in the House bill, but we want to make sure that obviously that perfect isn't the enemy of good. So moving forward, there are two real opportunities to pass immigration legislation. One is through the reconciliation process, and that's something that is a word that I think is part of our lexicons more and more each day here in Washington, D.C., and that would only require 50 votes. The question is what provisions could you get into a reconciliation package with regards to immigration, because it wouldn't likely be specific to immigration. So reconciliation essentially allows the Senate to move legislation forward with a simple majority. And as you can imagine, with a 50-50 Senate and Vice President Harris controlling the tie-breaking vote, that is something that is being looked at more and more, not only in the immigration space, but for other legislation as well. Obviously, there's also the opportunity to pass it as a standalone measure like we did in the House. And that's why we are pursuing efforts to recruit supporters, particularly on the Republican side, because we've already gotten good feedback from our Democratic friends that they want to be supportive of this. We just need to make sure that we have a good balanced product that can get over the hump. So happy to take any questions if there are on immigration and labor, but I know our time is precious, so I want to make sure that we can jump into one of the other issues that we're focusing on here that's been in the news, and that's transportation and infrastructure. If you could change the slide, Robert. Well, so transportation and infrastructure, a lot of you, I'm sure, have been watching the news, and it's been front and center right now because the question is, are we on the cusp of legislative victory on transportation and infrastructure reform that is so desperately needed, not only for our industry, but for so many others. Many of you may have read that there has been a bipartisan group of senators. Originally, it was 10 Democrats and 10 Republicans. It ended up becoming 21, which is always good because you add one more member, and we get closer and closer to the bipartisanship that we need. They have yielded, the negotiations have yielded a framework for legislation. There was some confusion in the press as to whether or not President Biden was supportive of the legislation or whether he was not. But that seems to be being ironed out at this point, as you have probably read. The legislation is based on core infrastructure projects that are so important to all of you. The return of earmarks is something that has been interesting for those of us who have been in Washington, D.C. for some time. You know, whatever you may think of earmarks, sometimes it's helpful to grease the wheels, so to speak. So when you think about earmarks, and as a former congressional staffer, what essentially they are congressionally directed legislative appropriations. So a member of Congress who is more familiar probably with what's going on in his or her district suggests that a project should be funded. And that helps get their vote, frankly, for the larger overall package. So that's something that has kind of changed the dynamics as we tackle some of these projects like infrastructure and other large appropriations bills. Now, you may have also read about some of the kind of confusion between the president and the Republicans that agreed to be part of the negotiations was about what's called human infrastructure. It's a new term. I don't think it exists in your Webster's dictionary, but it's legislation focused on some of the other issues, and a lot of it has been focused on healthcare, childcare, education. It's something that's very important to Democratic leaders in both the House and the Senate, as well as the White House. The question was whether or not they would be moved together. It has become clear, as I mentioned earlier, that they will be moving separately. It is likely that there could be some challenges in the House as to the timing. If they cannot in the Senate get a human infrastructure bill over there, because the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, would like to time those together. So as I said, administrative approach, a little rough out of the gate, but that's certainly normal. The INVEST Act, I just wanted to bring this up. That's the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Bill. What we're talking about with the Group of 21 in the larger infrastructure package builds on the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Bill that's required every couple of years, just like the Farm Bill is for agriculture programs. And that passed the House just recently. It was, I guess, technically bipartisan. There was only 2 Republicans that voted for it, but it's a pretty significant investment in our basic roads, bridges, and other surface transportation needs. So how do the 2 come together? It's a question, like I said, of whether or not we can build on the existing funding that's provided through programs like the INVEST Act with this larger infrastructure package. So process moving forward, it's kind of the same situation as I talked about reconciliation, a question of whether or not it can move as a standalone or whether or not the Democrats will have to move individually on these bills. The broad bipartisan support for the basic traditional infrastructure suggests that we probably may not need the reconciliation process to pass that legislation, and that it could move on its own. As I mentioned before, there are some hiccups along the way. So I'll stop there and happy to take any questions, Robert.
Thank you, John. What we're going to do is hold questions and discussions till the end. So thank you, John, for doing that and for giving us a good outcome or outliner for transportation and immigration and those issues. So I'm sure there'll be several questions for that. So I'm going to ask now Molly Van Loo, our Senior Director of Produce Nutrition, to talk about a few issues that we've been focusing on in the nutrition space that really are going to impact produce nutrition policy this year and beyond. So Molly.
Great, thank you, Robert. So as Robert said, these are issues kind of over the next year. So there's a lot that we could talk about, but WIC, child nutrition reauthorization, and of course the food box are all top of mind for us. So in terms of WIC, program that most people are probably familiar with at the grocery store at retail, you see the little shelf talkers that say WIC approved. And the great thing about produce is that all fresh produce is eligible for WIC. The bad thing is that it had been stuck at $9 a month for kids and $11 a month for pregnant and postpartum women for essentially since the start of the program in 2009. Obviously, that amount is too low and does not allow participants to purchase fruits and vegetables consistent with the dietary guidelines for Americans, which is the goal of the program, is to allow participants to meet those DGA recommendations. So over the course of the past year, we've been working really hard to talked to Congress about including an increase that's science-based, that aligns with the dietary guidelines, that would both address food and nutrition insecurity for the folks that participate in this program, and also the supply chain. WIC already exists. Granted, it's only retail, but it could help drive more commodities and more fruits and vegetable purchases at a time where we could really use it. So the American Rescue Plan that was passed earlier this year did include a 4-month increase, temporary increase to $35 per month per participant. So really significant, more than tripling the amount of the benefits. So that runs through September 2021. That's as far as we could get it. But the good news is that we're already getting data out of states, and the redemption rate is really high. It's really popular. States had the option of doing this, and all states have chosen to increase the benefits. So there's a lot of good momentum on the Hill around this. So the appropriations bill that passed out of committee, it's not fully passed, includes an increase of the benefit through September 2022. So that would get us to another year of these benefits. So that's kind of the short term what's going on. And this is a little confusing, but what traditionally happens is USDA kind of sets the policy for the food package and the amounts, and then Congress comes in and provides the funding. So what we really need to make the increase long-term is for USDA to update the entire food package for WIC, which would include the increase in fruits and vegetables to meet DGA recommendations. So USDA, the good news there, has indicated that this is on the docket for them, and late summer, early fall, they're going to get this moving. So hopefully by the end of this year, we're well on our way to making it a permanent increase. But in order to make sure that there's not a lapse in the increase right now, that's what we're asking for short term. So we can move on to child nutrition reauthorization. Great. So CNR, as we affectionately call it, is a perennial issue for us. It's a bill that is supposed to be reauthorized every 5 years. That being said, because these programs are really critical to the way schools and childcare facilities run, regardless of whether Congress formally reauthorizes it, they continue kind of as is. And for those of you who have been doing this for a while, the 2010 bill, which is the last time it was reauthorized, was really robust. It included nutrition standards updates for the first really meaningful standards update in 30 years. So there was a lot of catching up that many schools needed to do. So we haven't seen a new reauthorization bill since 2010, but that being said, there was a ton of implementation happening over these past 10 years. But particularly coming out of COVID, I guess, there are so many lessons learned and just experiences through school meals that could really influence how we move forward with child nutrition reauthorization. So typically we kind of leave off, we pick up where we last left off in our conversation on reauthorization, but this year we really have to take a fresh look at it based on kind of the existing challenges that schools are going through related to COVID, and then just the lessons learned as previously mentioned. So one thing that happened over the last year is that all schools were allowed to offer meals free of charge to students. And it turns out that was very popular, kind of all involved. It streamlined things. Schools really loved it. They didn't have to collect applications. They didn't have to worry about school meal debt, which you hear a lot about in kind of local news. And I think there's just kind of this culture shift of, in public school, you typically don't have to pay for, a student is not required to pay for anything, but for some reason we do that for food. So folks are really pushing to make meals free for all. It's also from a ordering and kind of supply chain. It's provides a lot of consistency because if it's free, obviously students are more likely to participate on a daily basis, and it makes menu planning easier. That being said, as popular as it is, I think on both sides of the aisle, the concept of it is expensive upfront. It takes a lot of pressure off of schools locally, but the actual kind of paycheck that federal government is putting out is significant. So that's the biggest challenge right now, is figuring out if there's a path forward for universal or healthy school meals for all. And I think the biggest issue moving forward. Of our United Fresh priorities, the new one, I guess you could say, is including a fruit and vegetable benefit in summer and weekend EBT for kids. So another part of COVID that came out was that if schools were closed for more than 5 days, kids were entitled to basically like a SNAP food stamp like benefit that allowed them their parents to purchase food for them in a retail environment if they otherwise would have been receiving free or reduced priced meals. And that was something that existed previously for summer in certain states. And the Biden administration has made it a priority that they would like to see that permanent for weekends and for summer. So our ask there is that if that becomes permanent, we would like to see a WIC-like fruit and vegetable benefit attached to that to ensure that those families have access to fruits and vegetables. Because obviously the buying power with an individual at retail is not as high as a school kind of doing these huge purchases. And we know the data shows us that kids get their healthiest meals from school, which includes a lot of fruits and vegetables consistent with the dietary guidelines, which is a theme. So we would like to see that fresh fruit and vegetable program, kind of our baby. We would like to see that expanded to all elementary schools. There's some really cool stuff that happened over the past year with COVID in terms of how we're distributing the FFEP program. And it really showed how popular it was. Parents saw the amazing fruits and vegetables that kids were getting at school. So we think that there is a lot of momentum and appetite to try to get that expanded. Again, making free meals permanent, that's something that we've aligned with our partners around and see the value in that. Another new one that came out of COVID is making schools eligible for any food box or emergency food distribution. So the Farmers to Families program worked really well. For schools that distributed it, they saw that the families really saw value of it. They were already coming to school to pick up meals, so it increased participation for those school meals. It was a dignified experience because the parents didn't feel as much stigma if they were just kind of picking up this amazing box of produce along with their kids' meals at school at an environment that is comfortable to them. So we would just, in any kind of future emergency food distribution, and emergency food distribution doesn't have to be just during like an emergency like we had now. Hopefully we don't ever have one again. But USDA on an ongoing basis provides kind of emergency food. So we'd like to see schools be part of that. And then finally, kitchen equipment funding. This is something we've been asking for about a decade. And we know coming out of COVID, schools are struggling even more financially. So they don't have kind of the internal capital to invest in kitchen equipment. So we want to make sure that they have support to continue to be able to serve perishable items like fruits and vegetables. So finally, produce box. So just in terms of process moving forward, the House is holding hearings, Senate is in negotiations, and it is something that we need to see significant action on this year before folks start focusing on the Farm Bill. Next slide. So finally, the produce box, or Farmers to Families, as the artist formerly known as. So USDA did decide to sunset that program earlier this year, and the last boxes went out in June, which we were really disappointed about. We had put together a working group with some, if I say so myself, some really great recommendations on how you could kind of fix the shortcomings of it and make this really wonderful program that provided access to fresh fruits and vegetables, which frankly USDA has not done a great job of historically. And through Farmers to Families, we really saw that there is a way to do it, to move high quality fresh fruits and vegetables quickly, where they're still in great shape by the time they get to the end consumer. There is bipartisan interest on this. I don't want to say it's not a silver lining that it ended, but because it ended, people are really feeling in their districts, members of Congress, the absence of this food, because there were 170 million boxes of food moved. So when you end that program, people are going to feel it. So we are getting some good bipartisan interest in trying to find a path forward to build out a better program. USDA has established what's called the TFAP Fresh Produce Box, and I know we have some members that are participating in that. Unfortunately, it's only about $10 million through September, which is a drop in the bucket compared to farmers and families and just in general, how we're spending money these days on food. And it's a low-cost bid, and there are some many shortcomings of it. So we think it's a piece, but it's not an adequate solution. Again, I said that really through Farmers to Families for the first time, we identified a mechanism to purchase a wide variety of fresh fruits and vegetables in meaningful amounts that can get to people who need them. There are a lot of creative partnerships. I previously mentioned public schools were distributing, YMCA, Boys and Girls Club. We're starting to form like really great partnerships with them and talking to the Hill because they did some amazing work on this too. I already mentioned the working group, so we continue to lift up those recommendations on the Hill. So our kind of task moving forward is just to continue to get the word out about as people are kind of coming up for air from Farmers to Families, because it got off the ground so quickly, sharing those stories, talking about what it means, whether that food is not, the fresh fruits and vegetables are not accessible to the folks that previously had them before. So we think that we'll be able to tell a really great story in September. So that's pretty much it for me. I will be happy to take questions. It sounds like at the end, and I'll turn it over to Randy.
Oh, let me go.
Sorry, I'll turn it back to Robert.
No, so I just wanted, all the great work Molly and the industry's doing in trying to, work on different programs to increase access to fresh produce and federal nutrition programs. It is a collective effort. It's not just our industry, the ability through a lot of things we've done over the last 18 months to build a very broad-based coalition of folks across the country, of organizations across the country, to build a better mousetrap, so to speak, of trying to, in terms of delivering fresh produce to those most in need, has been tremendous. And I think that work is going to continue to grow as we can continue to share all those stories that has helped our industry help those that are most in need. So Molly and her team and the work groups she works with, really well done. So now I'd like to turn it over to Randy to walk through some of the current issues in front of Capitol Hill. Kind of what it's like to get from a virtual environment to an in-person environment. And then it's also a few other issues that we think are kind of must-do issues that we think Congress is going to be working on. So Randy, happy to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Robert, and welcome. Look forward to seeing you all in September. I know it'll be a great session that we have. So before going into a couple of other issues besides the ones that John and Molly did a great job of covering, and by the way, I want to congratulate United and the great work that it's done, whether it's been on labor, and I know that has been a very difficult issue, but the ball is actually really moving forward, and we've gotten a good bill at least to start from in the House. And I know, John, you've worked very hard on it, and Tom and Robert, so congratulations on that. And hopefully we can get across the finish line in the Senate. And I know Molly's done a terrific job building out the coalition to try to build more fruits and vegetables in our federal feeding program. So great job on that. I want to take a step back and just spend a minute giving you a little kind of a vision of where we are in Washington at the current time, and then talk to you about two specific issues. And then I know we're going to open it up for some questions. Let's first look at the Biden administration. If you look at the first 6 months and where we are in terms of the president's approval rating, currently stands at about 55% on, if you take the Real Clear Politics average. That is considerably above where Trump was after 6 months, which was 36%, a little below where President Obama was, but also above where President Bush was. So certainly above the 50% kind of line. An area where the Biden administration's really pressed forward has been on executive orders, and they continue to issue executive orders. In fact, there's another one coming out this week that involves competition in the agriculture and food industry, and more to come about that. But if you look at the first basic 6 months, President Biden has put out 51 executive orders. That's more than Trump did at 39, and certainly Obama and Bush after 6 months had only put out 22. So they are clearly using the executive order authority to try to implement key parts of their agenda that they ran on going into the 2020 election. Something to keep in the back of your mind is that whether it's on the regulatory front or the executive order front, many of these are going to get challenged, particularly by conservative groups. And right now, if you look at the federal judiciary, 18 of the 12 federal courts of appeal are controlled by conservatives. Kind of a thing that people didn't focus on during the Trump administration. The Trump administration, working with Mitch McConnell in the Senate, got 234 federal judges approved during his first 4 years. We know about the Supreme Court, but probably even is equally important are the federal courts of appeal, where now conservatives control 8 of those 12 courts of appeal. So keep your eye on that, particularly on regulations on executive orders that may get challenged. Next slide, please. So when you look at Congress, as all of you know, in the history of the Congress, this is the closest margin that a majority party has ever had. And that's a pretty amazing situation. So if you're Nancy Pelosi, you've got basically a 5-seat advantage. And if you're Chuck Schumer, you can't lose one Democrat on any key vote. And then you need the vice president to be there to be the tie-breaking vote. And we've obviously seen that, as John alluded to, in some of the other bills that have come up, particularly as it relates to some of the COVID assistance packages. So historically, this is a historic period in terms of having the closest margin we've ever had in the history of Congress. I think a lot of people saw that as an opportunity potentially for bipartisanship, where the president and the administration would work closely with kind of the middle of the road Republicans and Democrats and try to get things done. Obviously, there's been a major tug and pull in the Democratic Party, where progressives are pushing very hard on their agenda, putting a lot of pressure on the speaker and on Chuck Schumer, who happens to be up for re-election in 2022. So the reality of it is we haven't seen a hell of a lot of bipartisanship, and probably more partisanship than maybe some anticipated when they saw the outcome of the Georgia seats, the Senate seats, and when we turned into this 50-50 Senate. Next slide, please. So looking ahead, you know, in Washington, we finish one election, and what do? We start worried about the next election. It's the way Washington operates. If you look at the House of Representatives, we said the Democrats have a 5-seat advantage right now. But a couple of things to keep in mind. One, remember in 2020, we did a census, and right now state legislatures in those states that use their legislature, others use nonpartisan commissions, will be redrawing all the congressional districts, the 435 that make up the House of Representatives. If you look at the states where seats are being picked up versus seats being lost, a lot of those seats are where Republicans control the governorship and both houses of the state legislature, which will be a real advantage when they start drawing these districts. That's one data point. Second data point is in the last 86 years, in the first midterm election after a president takes over, the party in the White House has lost seats in every midterm election, save 2 in the last 86 years. That was in 1934 when FDR was president. No, I was not there, but that was in the middle of the New Deal. And the other was in 2002 when George Bush was president. Other than those 2 times, the president's party has lost seats to the tune of, if his popularity is below 50%, they average losing 37 seats. And if his approval ratings above 50%, historically have lost an average of 14 seats. So if you put those 2 things together, redistricting and historical trends, if you're a betting person, you're going to bet that the House of Representatives flips come November of 2022. I'm just arguing that from historical trend as well as a redistricting play. In the Senate, there's 34 seats up in 2022, 14 Democrats and 20 Republicans. So, and there's a lot of retirements that Republicans have. We've got, an open seat in Missouri, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Alabama, and there may be others that come up. So we'll have to watch the Senate very closely. If there is a change, if the House does flip, that would mean that G.T. Thompson from Pennsylvania would be the chair and David Scott would be the ranking member. In other words, a flip of the current situation as we go into the all-important 2023 Farm Bill. Next slide, please. I'm going to digress for a moment. The last 15, 16 months, as Robert alluded to, has been a bit of a challenge for all of us. God knows how many Zooms we do in a day, or WebExes, or Microsoft Team meetings. And I think it was about a year ago, we did a similar webinar where several on this participated. And if we go to the next slide, I'll show you what it looked like 15 seconds before we went live on this. So as you can see here, we're all upright, ready to go. And our moderator, Mr. Gunther, was hanging upside down. And for about 5 minutes, couldn't figure out how to get his video to turn upright. And about 10 seconds before we went live, I think we had divine intervention, and Robert ended up in the right spot when we went live. But that is
I was going to turn my computer upside down to make it work.
You probably can't remember how he did it nor how he got out of it. But I think that's kind of symbolic of all the challenges that we've had. And I had to take a picture of it because it was hysterical. Not so much for Robert, but for the rest of us. We had a very good laugh about it. Next slide, please. Now Robert can't figure out how to move the slide. There we go. Thank you, Robert. Let me touch on 2 real quick issues, and then I know we're going to turn it over to you guys to fire questions at it. So let's go to the next slide. Let's talk a little bit about trade. Obviously, very, very important to the produce industry, whether we're talking about imports, whether we're talking about exports. Many of you have heard of Trade Promotion Authority, and this is the authority that is granted to the executive branch to go and negotiate bilateral and multilateral trade deals, whether it be Japan, Korea, the USMCA, and bring it back to Congress for an up or down vote, unamendable. So you have to vote for or against the agreement under a set time frame, and you cannot amend that agreement. That authority expired June 30th. So the administration, the Biden administration, no longer has trade promotion authority. They can still continue to negotiate, but they cannot bring back a package to Congress on an up or down vote, unamendable, without getting an extension of trade promotion authority. At some point this year, we anticipate that Ambassador Tai and the Biden administration will seek renewal of trade promotion authority. And historically, those have been very close votes. The last time the Congress enacted TPA was in 2015 during the Obama administration. That Senate vote was 60 to 37. So it was right at the 60 vote margin, and in the House, it was 219 to 212. So it's going to be a close vote, and there's going to be a lot of interest on key items that may be included in that Trade Promotion Authority package. So keep your eye on that. Another thing to point out, we are now sitting 6 months into the Biden administration, and we do not have an ag trade ambassador nominated, and we do not have an undersecretary for trade nominated at USDA. And I think those are two critically important positions from a trade perspective. And I certainly hope that here in the next month or two, we get nominees forward so that we can get those key vacancies filled. And then if we can go to the last slide, Robert, wanted just to touch very quickly about climate. The Biden administration has made climate a major issue, as well as the Democratic leadership in the Congress. And, you know, the last time that Congress debated the issue of climate was in 2009. And some of you may recall the so-called cap and trade debate that occurred in the House of Representatives. In the end, that legislation did not end up being sent to the White House, kind of collapsed under its own weight. But things have changed dramatically since 2009. And let me cite a couple of things. First of all, there's a growing segment of the consumer marketplace that is asking for products that they buy to have less of an environmental footprint. And what do I mean by that? There was a recent poll that was put out that showed consumers, adult consumers from the ages of 21 to 40, they asked, would they pay more for their food if it was shown that those products lessened their environmental footprint? And 70% of them said they would pay more for their food if it lessened the environmental footprint. So the consumer marketplace is changing. Also, the investor and shareholder community, in terms of its awareness on environmental and sustainability issues, has risen dramatically. There's a Dow Jones Industrial Average of 300 companies now in the ESG space, as we call it, environment, sustainability, and governance. There are a lot of investor community interest in watching companies and what they do in terms of climate, environmental, and sustainability initiatives, and are investing based upon that. And even at the grower level, we're seeing much more of an awareness that climate is impacting agricultural production. There was a recent poll done by Iowa State University that showed that 81% of the farmers in Iowa believe that climate change is occurring, which is up from 68% in 2011. But over half of them said that even on their own farm, they're experiencing the impact of climate on their own farming operations. So whether we're talking about the consumer marketplace, the investor community, or whether we're talking about farmers themselves, there's a growing awareness of the impact of climate variation and what it means in terms of production. So what's going on in Congress? There's a lot of focus on this issue, particularly in the agriculture community. Secretary Vilsack has made this kind of a mainstay of him coming back as a second term, and has Robert Bonnie, who is his deputy chief of staff, who's been nominated to be an undersecretary at USDA that's kind of leading the charge on climate. And what I would suspect you will see in the human infrastructure package that John talked about a little bit earlier, I would suspect you'll see substantial sums of money, assuming that bill makes it all the way to the president, substantial amounts of money made available to incentivize production agriculture to adopt more environmentally friendly practices, done on a voluntary basis, not on a mandatory basis. And I think also what you're seeing now is agriculture and the entire food value chain, including conservation groups, producer groups, food companies, processors, the forestry interest, all coming together and saying, ag wants a seat at the table. Ag wants to make sure that they have a voice in this debate. And whatever is done on a should be done on a voluntary basis, should be incentive-based, and encourages the adoption of climate-friendly practices. So with that, Robert, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thanks, Randy. Appreciate that, the comments as always, and your perspective on all these issues is very important. So what I want to do now before we get into some questions and discussion is kind of outline the Washington Conference schedule. As you can see here, we're looking at doing a very traditional conference schedule. The first day we'll be focusing on getting you ready for Capitol Hill. So on top of these, this webinar and the two others that we'll be having later this summer, as well as we're going to be doing an advocacy boot camp in the afternoon on Monday. That'll be part of kind of getting you ready to go to Capitol Hill to meet with your members of Congress. There will be a reception on Monday night, as well as a welcome reception for all attendees. So on Tuesday, we will have a breakfast and lunch general sessions. We also will have exchange sessions where we'll focus on the issues that we're going to be talking about with elected leaders. There also will be a roundtable with allied association leaders talking about the new organization that'll begin in 2022 of next year in January. And also we're excited to bring back the Fresh Pack Dinner. Again, it'll be at the Charlie Palmer's rooftop, which a number of you have participated in, which will be overlooking the U.S. Capitol. So we're looking forward with a good big dinner that night with a lot of interesting topics and comments and programming scheduled for you. So on Wednesday, we also will come back together in the morning for a general session. And then, as you noticed on Tuesday and Wednesday, we have what we're calling Congressional Connections. And this will be our quasi-march on Capitol Hill, and I'll talk about that in a second. But what I wanted to mention to you that backed by popular demand, because it was so successful last year, is we will still be having virtual meetings after the conference with Capitol Hill, with members of Congress. We're going to hold those over about a 6-day, 7-day period, and they will be available only for registered attendees. So we will be bringing that back, and those are going to be geared towards those meetings we potentially could not have put together in person during while you're in Washington, D.C. So a lot of talk about, again, D.C., the visits from Washington, D.C. Kind of give you a quick update of what's happening currently on Capitol Hill. As we put up here, basically more than half the Capitol offices aren't even accepting in-person meetings at this time. That's because of their own personal policy. That's because of some of the restrictions that have been put forward by the Capitol Police and by the pandemic still going on, and offices just have not opened up. But basically, almost like half the Capitol offices are not doing in-person meetings as of today. And so those meetings that you can, or those offices you can go to, staff are escorting folks, limit to 5 to that office, and then escorting them out. There's basically one entrance to each building. And then the good news is, starting tomorrow and over the weekend, there will be the Capitol fence that's been around the Capitol because of what happened on January 6th is being removed. So again, that's another step towards more opening up the Capitol grounds, as we call it. So folks not just have meetings, but tourists can come back. So we hope the progress is moving forward to having a fully open Capitol grounds by the time by the time the Washington Conference comes about. But we'll be continuing to update you and others, or people who are coming to Washington Conference, about that progress as it goes forward. So based on that, we have put together a number of several different options that we are considering going with. And basically it's really down to, if the grounds are fully open, we will go back to more of a traditional march on Capitol Hill with teams and going to the House and Senate offices for meetings. There also will be an option we're looking at as having group meetings around Capitol Hill. So securing spaces where groups will be put in, or will be situated in certain locations, and members of Congress will come through in 30 to 45 minute segments to kind of talk with folks in each of these meetings and rooms. And then finally, the other option is bringing the members of Congress to the conference hotel. I think that's another option we are considering, well, I know we're considering. And again, this would be in groups where members of Congress would come and have a meeting with their constituents and other interested people who would like to sit in on those meetings. But I would say really the bottom line is we will be meeting with Congress. We have talked to a lot of the offices who are eager to have face-to-face meetings with their constituents. They're excited about us having our conference back in person in Washington, D.C. It may be one of the first ones. I know some groups have slowly started bringing smaller groups back starting this month to Washington, D.C. But in terms of having a full conference, we're going to be probably one of the first ones out of the gate, so to speak, here in D.C. that are coming back. So across all different sectors and interests. So very excited to do that. But we want to ensure that everybody knows we will be meeting with congressional members. And again, the reason why it's the most important part of our conference to share our views about issues impacting the fresh produce industry. So I will stop there. We have a few minutes for questions. I know there was a couple questions that came up. Let's see. One, and I'm going to ask John Holly to kind of talk through this a little bit. It was a question related to the current situation where undocumented workers are considered essential, and so you need to worry about having the ability to be sent out of the country. That be extended, continue to be extended down the road.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. Great question. So one of the most important things that we did at the beginning of the COVID process was to advocate to make sure that folks throughout the supply chain, the food supply chain, were given that designation as being essential. We have been able to maintain that designation. There is no expected change to that designation. One of the things that we continue to monitor is to make sure that the individual countries in which some of those workers are coming in through maintain an open status with the US so that we can keep those essential workers coming in. But yes, we fully expect that they will continue to be essential workers going forward.
Okay, I'm going to open this up maybe to Randy. So the question is, environmental social governance is kind of where the retail, the customer side is really forcing you from their suppliers to incur costs related to climate-friendly policy. Is that really something that's going to continue? How does government step in on that? I mean, is this going to be more of, is climate going to be, I'm paraphrasing here a little bit of what John Pandel said, is climate change going to be, will the government be able to supersede some of the downward pressure on the supply chain that the current retailers and others are pushing on their suppliers?
Yeah, Robert, it's really two issues there. One is going back, and I alluded to this in 2009, when the House of Representatives were debating the climate legislation. It was known as cap and trade. I think that was the Markey bill, was back from Massachusetts then when he was in the House. But anyhow, that really set a price on carbon. And very frankly, for the agriculture and food industry, that would have been a very expensive proposition. It was a very government top-down regulatory system that would have imposed a lot of costs, whether you're at the producer level all the way through the retail level. Obviously, separate from that effort, the marketplace is dictating a lot of these things right now. And I agree, retailers have their own requirements that they are putting down through the system. And I think what Congress is looking at through the Agriculture Committee is trying to incentivize producers rather than mandate. In other words, do it on a voluntary basis, incentivize them to adopt practices that capture carbon and reduce methane emissions. And if you look at agriculture, according to EPA, these aren't my figures, these are EPA's figures. Agriculture contributes about 10% of all greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. It's above 20% globally, but in the United States. And if you look at methane, methane's estimated by scientists to be about 25 times more potent than carbon is. So there's a major effort to try to reduce methane emissions through feed practices with livestock, also through methane digesters, and to incent livestock producers to do that. And on the row crop and specialty crop side, and on the forestry side, trying to incent producers to adopt practices where we capture more of the carbon. I think by doing that, we can avoid having a tax on carbon or other steps that would be much more draconian and frankly, very costly to the ag and food industry.
Great. Randy, let me follow up with that real quick with a question related to, you've talked, it seems the current debate is around mostly traditional agriculture, the forestry industry. That's where a lot of the debate's going on, with not a lot of discussion in the specialty crop, fruit and vegetable world of our impact, our potential benefits from climate change. How do you see that as our role and what we should be playing in that space to bring forward our potential ability to have a stronger voice in this discussion?
Robert, right now, a lot of the focus, as I mentioned, on the row crop side is very Midwest oriented, where you have large corn and soybean acreage. But I think in terms of the role that specialty crops can play, whether we're talking about tree fruits, whether we're talking about tree nuts, whether we're talking about other produce items, it isn't just when I look at this, and I look at it from a climate and a sustainability environmental, there's a lot of different issues there. There's soil health, there's resiliency of the ag practices that are used, there's water usage, and some of the great things that the produce industry is doing in that regard. So I think there's a real opportunity for specialty crops to play in this space. I think we need to broaden the definition of what we're talking about when we talk about sustainability and environment, to ensure that the specialty crop industry is viewed as being part of the solution when it comes to this legislation. One other thing, and I want to put this out there. John alluded to the human infrastructure bill, and there's going to be, I predict, quite a bit of money put in there for agriculture. When we get to writing a 2023 farm bill, there isn't going to be any new money laying around as we try to get more money for the specialty crop provisions of the farm bill. So this is a real opportunity for agriculture to get some additional funding, including the specialty crop industry. So we need to be sitting at the table. We need to be participating because that could pay big dividends when we get to 2023 to write a new farm bill. When I can guarantee you, when we're running a $30 trillion debt, which we will be running by the end of this year, $30 trillion, there isn't going to be any new money available for a farm bill.
Great. Well, thank you, Randy. So I wanted just to remind folks that we have several other, as I mentioned earlier, opportunities to learn about what's happening here. Our next webinar will be Thursday, August 5th, how to sell fresh produce to Congress. This will be more messaging, communication, what are going to be some key messages that we want to tell Congress to make an impact on Capitol Hill, but also how do we talk about it? What do we say about it? And then finally, the last webinar will be again, final chance for review prior to the Washington conference the following week, which will be happening the following week, kind of last minute instructions, last minute things that we need to talk about related to what's going to be happening when you get here to DC. And then, as I mentioned on site, we're real excited to bring back our Produce Advocacy Bootcamp. I know that was highly popular in 2019. And we're looking forward to bringing that back Monday afternoon to again, those who have never been, but also those who have been here to Washington, DC, to really focus on our issues and key messages and how do we address Congress for this year and beyond. So with that, I want to thank everybody for being on today's conference or webinar. And then hopefully we hope to see you back on more of these webinars in August and September. But most importantly, we hope to see you here in September in Washington, D.C. So with that, have a great rest of your day and look forward to talking to you soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.